Kapital driveren av det grønne skiftet. Ta vel imot en av de som viser vei fra Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Michael Liebreich.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here back in Oslo once again for this great conference. My name is Michael Liebreich. I'm the founder and now chairman of the advisory board of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and also, as it happens, on the board of the Transport for London, which is the transport authority in London. What I'll do over the next 15 minutes is talk a little bit about some of the trends in the energy space, not just clean energy, that are driving the financing flows. So when I last came here to Oslo, I think it was 2014, we had seen a couple of years of reductions in the investment volume in clean energy. What we're seeing here is renewable energy, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage to the extent there is any, all of the direct investments that we can capture as a financial information provider, investments in clean energy. Now, it doesn't include natural gas, it doesn't include nuclear, which are all part of the solutions, and lots of energy efficiency investment is embedded deeply in the economy and very difficult for us to identify as separate investments. But nevertheless, what you can see is the investment surged from very low levels a decade ago and now are at a level of about $1/3 of $1 trillion per year. $1/3 of $1 trillion. And put that in perspective, that's out of an energy investment pot of somewhere around $2 trillion a year. It depends how you define the borders of the energy sector. But around $2 trillion a year. There's about $600 billion that gets invested every year in oil and gas. Here you've got $300 billion invested in clean energy. And as I say, over the 2 years, 2012-13, we saw that investment flow drop. Why did it drop? We did lots of work, lots of analysis. 2/3 of it was because of the reduction in costs in clean energy, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other third was because there was a real reduction in investment activity, largely due to Europe, Southern Europe, the fiscal crisis, and so on. And then 2014, for the first time for 2 years, we saw an increase once again. And in fact, we've just produced the figures for the first 3 quarters of this year. And there you can see that behind me there, the red line is the rolling average for the quarters. And what you can see is this year is, again, a healthy year. We were concerned at the beginning of the year. You've got a strong dollar. You've got continuing European problems, maybe some worries about China. But what we actually see is that investment in clean energy remains strong. Now, this is not because of the Pope's intervention, useful though it was, saying there is an urgent need to develop sources of renewable energy. Now, I always thought encyclicals were written in Latin, and so I actually went to try and find out how do you say renewable energy in Latin. It turns out that this encyclical, I think, was written in Italian, so maybe there'll be a translation at some point. But that's not the reason why the flow of investment has been first increasing and then remaining strong. The reason is this. This is an experience curve. The way experience curves work is that for every doubling of the cumulative experience in a particular sector, you see a constant reduction in costs. It doesn't apply to resource industries where you might have depletion issues, but it applies to every other area of economic activity that I've ever looked at. That's an experience curve for wind. What it shows is every time the wind industry doubles, you get around a 19% reduction in costs. And where we've got to now is the point that wind, the cheapest wind, the best wind, can be built for around 4 US cents per kilowatt hour. 4 US cents per kilowatt hour, $40 per megawatt hour, which is less than any other source of new generating capacity. In solar, this is a chap called Paddy Padmanathan. He's the CEO of a company called Aqua Power. I refer to him as the Usain Bolt of solar. Why? Because early this year, in January, he announced a project in Dubai, not known for its previous investments in solar, producing solar power at an unsubsidized level of under 6 cents, 5.84 cents. This was an eye-opening low cost, but now what we're seeing around the world is that we are in an era of 6-cent solar. Not everywhere, not every project, but that quite clearly is the future. So we're seeing these very low costs of renewable energy. We do a huge modeling exercise once a year. It's called NEO, the New Energy Outlook, and this is the summary that as we go forwards between now and 2040, there's going to be about $12 trillion invested in energy generating capacity around the world, developing world, developed world, and about 2/3 of it will be invested in renewable energy. 2/3 of it, so 8 trillion between now and 2040 that will be invested in renewable energy. Now, what will that do to the grid? Because that's the renewable energy, and it's driven by these low costs. But of course, this is going to have a profound impact on the structure of our energy system. What you see up there is the current proportion of intermittent renewables. Renewables used to have two problems. They were expensive, and they were intermittent. And we've just seen they're not expensive anymore, but they are still intermittent. And there you can see the intermittency. In the UK, 9%. That's out of total renewable electricity the first half of this year, of just under 25%, up from 3% a few years ago. But the intermittent renewables still only 9 or 10%. Germany, 16%, India, 3%, Mexico, 3%. Very manageable. When that's how much intermittency you have, not a problem to manage. But this is the picture for 2040. And you see much higher levels of intermittency, much, much higher. In the case of the UK, 63%, Germany, 77%, Japan, 20%, US, 24%, and so on. Even developing countries, India, 32%, enormous investment required to manage that sort of intermittency. Now, it's often portrayed as being a showstopper. It's not, because the renewable energy is so cheap that it frees up the budget to manage that intermittency. Now, going back to the Pope, what he said was there's still a need to develop adequate storage technologies. I think he said that before checking out Mr. Musk's power wall there. I don't know if Elon Musk would have agreed that his storage technology is not adequate. But, you know, we jump to saying, well, there's intermittency, so we need storage at our peril. Because actually, there's a merit order in managing intermittency. There are just cheaper ways of doing it and more expensive ways of doing it. And what we need to do in order to effect this transition is do the cheap ones first. So the cheapest is energy efficiency. Because you save money, you reduce the scale of the problem. It doesn't deal with intermittency, but it reduces the scale of investment required across the energy sector. So that's always number one. But then you've got these two, improving forecasting and demand management, shifting demand so that you use the energy when you produce it rather than using it at times when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining and it's very expensive to manage. The next thing you do, though, is interconnection, and only then do you do storage. I've just come from a conference in California of systems operators, and they are all talking about how do you integrate across a broader area in order to smooth out the peaks and the troughs of the intermittency. And this is very important here and for this audience. Why? because this is the area where Norway has something very special to offer the European energy system. You probably all know that there's discussions about new interconnections. It is critically important that these are accelerated, completed, and more interconnections are built. This is how we enable the European grid to shift to these very high proportions of renewable energy at an affordable price point. And if people here are concerned that it will drive up the electricity costs, they should be thinking about how to invest in production and thinking about this as an export opportunity. It's also, by the way, an import opportunity to get cheap renewable energy when it's not all being used, so it's solar power in Europe, when it's being dumped and not used, could be flowing in here to reduce costs. So it works both ways. Now, one of the losers in all of this transition, this shift to clean energy, is of course coal. What you've got there is the coal price, and you can see it sliding gently down, and that has caused real pain in the coal industry. We also need to talk about Norway's role as an investor. Here you have an index of coal stocks. If you'd have put $1 in these stocks, or not divested $1 that was already in them, that would now be worth 25 cents from the beginning of 2013 to now. That is oil and gas, and that is clean energy. A clear shift in value from coal towards clean energy. And I call this divestment by value destruction. You don't actually have to sell anything in order for your coal holdings to reduce. Another way of putting it would be perhaps Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, the Massachusetts Pension Fund, your coal investments took a hell of a beating. But let's talk about divestment, real divestment, selling things. What you've got now is $3.6 trillion of assets under management in institutions that have said they're going to divest. And it's very impressive, and you can compare it to the size of the fossil fuel market cap, which is $4.7 billion. This is the enterprise value, equity and debt. And it's very easy to portray this as a struggle of good and evil, and divestment is good, and we're going to win, and so on. But let's be absolutely clear about the real scale of actual divestment. Right? $9 billion actually sold, mainly of coal. So I leave you to judge which is the more important trend, the economic destruction of value in the coal industry, or this movement, which gets a lot of coverage, raises important issues, but in and of itself is not going to starve fossil fuel companies of capital. Let's just do a little tour of the other areas that are of importance. Of course, oil. This is from The Economist. It's a fabulous cartoon. Saudi Arabia and the US. And it sums up what people, the commentators, talk about in the oil industry. That's production and consumption. This is the US. And everybody focuses on the extraordinary increase in production. But look at consumption. There's something going on in consumption. And what that is the miles traveled, 10% gap to trend, and also vehicle efficiency. Nearly a 30% improvement in vehicle efficiency over 13 years. Demand for oil is not meeting the very ambitious projections that are constantly being produced by the IEA, EIA, and so on. Now, we also know about electric vehicles. The future is electric. That's a Tesla. You probably all own Teslas. We've heard about what's going on here in Oslo. And indeed, the Washington Post said, prices on electric cars will continue to drop until they're within the reach of the average family. That means the average, not just here. Sadly, that was actually written in 1915 about one of those. But we are bullish about electric vehicles, and it's partly, here's another experience curve that shows electric vehicle batteries compared to the experience curve for solar. It's not quite the same slope, but it's very definitely there, and prices dropping very rapidly. By 2020, electric vehicles probably fully competitive on a total cost of ownership basis. But there's also this, Dieselgate. And Dieselgate is not just about VW in the US. It's about this. This is Beijing. This is Shanghai. This is Delhi, Hong Kong, Singapore, Los Angeles, Paris, and London. The fact is, air quality is a huge issue, and it's very difficult to address whilst reliant on internal combustion engines, particularly diesel. And we know also that there are lots of solutions for these air quality issues that improve cities. Not all of them will actually happen. And there's a discussion I know here in Oslo about making the center car-free. And that is going to be a debate in city after city around the world. Now, I would also like to touch on gas. I don't have time. I know I'm overrunning here. But we're seeing in gas prices coming down, these very big spreads between Asian gas prices and US gas prices being compressed. We all know that the rig counts in the US are going down. They're not exploring as much, and yet somehow the volume of gas production continues to go up. But the way I summarize it all is this. We're in an age of energy plenty, cheap renewables, cheap coal, cheap gas, cheap oil. And I think we need to expect that to continue out into the future, and that has implications here very clearly. And it's also an age of vicious competition between different energy types. And we need to think about that as we think about the climate discussions going on soon in Paris. Now, we know and we agree this is the G7 who said emissions must be cut 40 to 70% by mid-century and phased out entirely by 2100. This is now not an extreme position, it's the mainstream position. It could not be more mainstream. However, take all the trends and put them together, and our modeling shows by 2040, we will still be using 44% in our electricity mix of fossil fuels. Add transport and add heat, and we clearly have a big problem. So we can effect a transition to clean energy. It can be done, but I leave you the words of El Gallo, this fantastic bullfighter who said, "It is impossible and also very difficult." Thank you.